All right, look at this. We are live, folks. Good Wednesday. Thank you for joining us here for our latest installment of We Brew With You online. Been doing this for the past month or so and building a library of information, talks, presentations. You can find all this on our YouTube channel in the library there, and then keep your eye peeled on social and media, alternative media channels for future presentations. We've got a chat section for you to have a discussion amongst yourselves off to the sides, and then if you have a question about today's topic or really anything else over the course of the next hour-ish or so, feel free to drop that in, and we will get to it. If not during the course of the presentation, certainly in follow-up. Now, my name is Brian Perkey. I'll be conducting today's exercise on yeast nutrition and ensuring your yeast health. I'm the North American Regional Sales Manager for Lallemand. Just a couple of things about me. I entered the brewing industry back in 1992 at a little place called Bridgeport in Portland, Oregon. Spent 18 years in breweries and cideries up and down the West Coast, the likes of Full Sail, Gordon Biersch, etc. Spent a little time with a liquid yeast manufacturer, malt supplier out of the UK, and I've had the great pleasure of serving as the regional sales manager here in North America for the past few years for Lallemand. We are a privately held Canadian company. For those of you who don't know who we are, founded a little over 100 years ago. We specialize in the development of yeast and bacteria, not only research side, but straight production on an industrial scale. And we market these products to a variety of different market segments out there, including wine, biofuels, spirits, animal and plant nutrition, specialty cultures. Think cheeses and sausages, bioingredients, probiotics, which some of you may know and use in sour beer production. Think the lactobacillus strains. So we've been around a while. We've got our fingers in a lot of different pies. Over 4,000 employees in 45 countries on 5 continents. We've been involved in the beer side of the business since the early 70s. First dipping our toe in on the kit business. Remember those little white packet sachet of yeast that you would get on the can of your pre-hopped malt extract? We had a hand in that, and we've come a long way since then. Not only in the quality, variety, and understanding of how dried yeast is employed in brewing processes, but we've come a long way from then till now, and we've got a wide range of both brewing yeast and bacteria for for your use, and we'll talk a little bit about those here in a bit. It's not going to be a big sales pitch, though. We acquired a Siebel Institute 20 some odd years back. You may know of this outfit. Probably have a brewery. There isn't probably a brewery out there that hasn't had a Siebel grad roll through there through one point in time. Also, the acquisition of AB Vickers in Burton-on-Trent in the UK. They specialize in enzymes, findings, etc. And then most recently, the Scott Labs in Petaluma, California, and St. Catharines, Ontario, to provide a fulfillment, actually getting it out directly to the market. So we're a big outfit. We serve all segments of the brewing industry with products, services, and education. Here's a little bit of our lineup. What's not on there is the new to be released Philly Sour, which is a Licentia strain. You can keep your eye peeled for that. And then here's some of the items out of Vickers, Siebel, and Scott Labs. Awesome. Okay, so all of that aside, why are we talking nutrition? I thought this was an opportune time, given the fact that there's a lot of hard cider and seltzer production going on. Nutrients is one of the most misunderstood aspect of brewing science. We as brewers need to understand the difference in what we're trying to achieve, or what we're asking from the yeast in the production of beer versus what yeast is actually trying to do in its reproductive cycle. So through the course of this presentation, I'm going to be able to describe the nutritional requirements of yeast. We'll talk about the necessary nutrients that are obtained from wort. We're going to explain why oxygen is vital and exactly what it does. We'll talk about the uptake and the utilization of nutrients, and we're also going to understand the impact of glucose repression, and this is kind of key when it comes to the non-malt worts or washes that are being produced for not only a high adjunct or high gravity beers, but yeah, seltzers, ciders, and even the hand sanitizers that have been part of the most recent COVID exercise. So really, as we discussed earlier, the difference between what you're trying to do as a brewer and what the yeast is trying to do is totally different. They don't care one whit about your recipe. All they're trying to do is reproduce themselves. Let's see here. Give me 1 second, and I'm going to try to bring up some some notes here. Okay. Sorry about that. So our job as brewers are really to provide a wort that we're looking to control, not only how much yeast is produced, but all of the other components that we're going to achieve through a metabolic process. So obviously alcohols and CO2 are part of that, but also glycerol, esters, aldehydes, and ketones. Sulfur compounds, typically off-putting, additional phenols and autolytic compounds. Also think acids, organic and fatty. And then there's a higher ethanol or higher fusel alcohols that we're trying to control as well. And really, what that does is it's a complex process. So it impacts the 900 total flavor compounds, and specifically the 400 that are yeast derived. This flavor wheel here is from the ASBC, so it shows you at just how complex this whole process of fermentation actually is. So really and if you have chat questions or other questions during the course of this, go ahead and just add those in, and we will get to those at the end of the presentation. So the elemental requirements of yeast can really be broken down into a couple of different categories: macro elements and micro elements. So macro contain carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, magnesium, and these are typically required in the hundreds of parts per million. And then the micro elements sub that level: calcium, zinc, iron, nickel, etc. So there are other micro elements in the form of metals that can be toxic. Think mercury, lead, aluminum. So you have to be cognizant of that as well. The function of these principal elements are noted on this slide. You can see the micro or the macro elements, and really they are essential, not only in the structural integrity of the yeast, but also through many enzyme cofactors. The microelements really look at calcium. I mean, they're all important, don't get me wrong, but pay attention to the calcium for flocculation, and zinc for the alcohol dehydrogenase pathway to ethanol production. Without that, you're going to end up with stuck ferment. So as brewers, what we're trying to deliver in regards to yeast nutrients in wort, carbohydrates come in the form of fermentable sugars, nitrogen sources, mainly amino acids. We have inorganic sources of nutrients as well. Potassium, sulfur, magnesium, other minerals, oxygen. So O2 comes from compressed air, tank air. We won't get into olive oil or oleic acid in that regard, but then there's other yeast foods, vitamins, fatty acids, sterols, minerals, etc. So in here, what you can see is the difference between, excuse me, difference between the wort that we're delivering and its kind of a nutrient makeup there versus the beer that's being delivered in return. And of note here, please keep in mind that 4%. So this is a 1040 wort, standard wort. Keep in mind that 4% alcohol requires a huge amount of energy in the form of carbohydrate in order to get there. And we'll talk about that active diffusion process later. But also of note is look at the acid production, the pH drop you see, and that's also requires a fair amount of energy. So the influences that wort composition delivers to our ability to control the brewing process is we are looking to control the rate and degree of attenuation. So we want a good fermentation performance. We want to try to control the amount of yeast produced. Excess yeast production as biomass actually comes across as a loss. Concurrently in higher gravity worts, we can see a reduced amount of biomass. So that's something to be cognizant of as well. Nutrient makeup in wort composition also impacts the primary characteristics of your beer: flavor, foam, aroma, the physical appearance of your beer, and of course how not only how does this beer finish out, but how well does that yeast flock out or not, if that's what you're choosing to do. So all of these factors are some of the critical reasons why you need to pay attention to your nutrient makeup in the wort streams for the beers that you all are producing. Okay, so primary carbon source as carb that we're delivering to the yeast. Look at the hexa sugars and the di and the trisaccharides. So glucose, fructose, Sucrose, these can be classified as primary sugars. We'll talk about a little bit about those shortly. The maltose and maltose or maltotriose sugars are really the other primary carbon sources that yeast are going to employ. And then based on the strain, think non-sac strains like Brettanomyces or Lysandria, the poly, oligo, and tetrasaccharides will come into employ. Also of note, think a diastaticus expressed Cerevisiae strain is going to consume these sugars, complex sugars, differently than most yeast strains, and usually these go relatively slow. And we'll talk about uptake speeds later in the presentation here. Again, if you have questions, put them up, and we'll get to them at the end of the gig here. So here you can see what a typical sugar composition of wort would be. Looking at the mono and the disaccharide makeup here, you can anticipate 60, and then with the employ of some maltotriose, 60 to 70% of most wort compositions are going to be consumed by most standard ferments with maltotetrose and maltodextrins coming into employ or not later in the line, and this can really impact that mouthfeel, the body, the visual representation of what it is that you're trying to produce. So we'll talk a bit about nitrogen here. Without sufficient nitrogen, your yeast will not ferment. So most wort compositions have basically the nitrogen you need, unless you start pushing beyond what a standard ferment might be. Typically your free amino, free available nitrogen fan should be at least 150 milligrams per liter. Some of the amino acids linked to beer flavor compounds are metabolized through a diffused pathway, which we'll discuss later on as well. So it's important to have nitrogen in your wort stream. Yeast takes most amino acids up in a very specific order. So timing of additions is something to consider as well. Some inorganic sources of minerals available. Most nutrient or most wort streams, malt wort is going to be sufficient in phosphorus, sulfur, potassium. They can possibly be deficient in zinc and the magnesium to calcium ratio that you'll need to achieve in your wort based on the fermentation you're doing versus, say, like a propagation. We'll talk a little bit about that here in a minute. Some elemental roles of metal ions in brewing. So we're all pretty familiar about this concept. Think about the water tables of the historical versions of the beers that you're trying to produce. So we all know IPA, a Burtonization of your water source. Pilsen in the Czech Republic, Munich's water. I mean, we could go all around the world and look at water tables and the types of beers that were developed out of those regions based on the metal ions that existed in there naturally. So part of this, here, not only does metals or metal ions have a role in not just flavor, but the stability of your beer. So foam, oxidative prevention. Look on this slide at how important calcium is in a variety of for a variety of factors. Not only from wort pH, but the precipitation of oxalate, the formation and employ of alpha amylase. And of course, yeast flock mechanisms. It's critical for all those actions. Look at zinc in helping prevent stuck fermentations and providing the necessary nutrient to get a healthy ferment, and copper in the elimination or prevention of sulfury flavors, many of which can be off-putting if not there by design. So, why do yeast need metal? Well, we all need a little metal from time to time. Gets the blood pumping, keeps us healthy. These are the variety of factors of why trace metal ions are important for yeast health, not only for cell division, but enzyme activity, stress tolerance, cell growth, and structure integrity, and then of course cell-to-cell interactions. Think flocculation. So, and the manipulation of these minerals, it's kind of key for us, because again, we've brought this up before. What we're trying to do as brewers is very different from what the yeast is trying to do in and of itself. Now that can play to our favor, but we just have to be cognizant of the rules and how to go about the use of the correct additions of nutrients in order to achieve our final result. Most of the time, that's ethanol production. Sometimes, in a prop situation, yeah, we're looking at growing some yeast. So there's a few key minerals that I want to talk about here. The third least understood or utilized is magnesium. This is absolutely required for glycolysis. Again, the pyruvic acid pathway to ethanol production. There's a direct relationship in the viability and vitality of your yeast. So key if you plan on harvesting repitching, and it's a key stress protectant. Think osmotic, think thermal, think ethanol stresses. Magnesium plays a role in all of those. We talked a little bit about the role of magnesium versus calcium. So there's a bit of an antagonistic role here. A certain amount of magnesium that's required for healthy cell growth. It can be repressed though, or suppressed by excessive amounts of calcium in your wort. So you have to be cognizant of those levels as well. Now, zinc, which is a key element in brewing. It's essential for not only yeast physiology but performance. It's utilized rapidly. There is a minimum requirement of 0.3 ppm in zinc, and this is in support of an alcohol dehydrogenase enzyme, and it's also key in membrane stabilization. The biggest nutrient that we sell is cervomyces. It's a zinc-enriched yeast product to be added as a nutrient to help provide zinc in brewing. Is a minimum of 6 milligrams per 100 grams of yeast by dry mast for healthy yeast activity. It's non-toxic up to 1 milligram per liter, but as with most things, too much of a good thing probably is. It's an essential component of several enzymes, coenzymes. It provides a high protective factor level. It's a carbohydrate, protein, and fat metabolic stimulator. And it helps accelerate maltose and maltotriose uptake, leading to a faster fermentation. So thinking back to the carbon slide, aside from the 3 primary sugars, fructose, glucose, sucrose, yeast really needs zinc to efficiently take care of the maltose and maltotriose sugars that you're providing. So some important factors to consider that these minerals should not be ignored. It's essential to monitor and optimize specifically magnesium, calcium, and zinc in your fermentation medium. Zinc uptake is rapid and complete. We'll talk a little bit about this and why that's important, specifically for those folks that are doing sugar washes, where glucose suppression comes into play. We know that low zinc can be problematic, especially for finishing off a malt fermentation. the requirements can be different from a prop regimen to a fermentation regimen. So you'll need to keep that in mind when you're designing a nutrient charge for a prop. Low levels of some of these key minerals can impact your yeast ability to resist stress, how they will ultimately finish off a ferment, and then flocculate and get out of the way. There is a topic that I won't get into today about yeast preconditioning, but this is primarily in propagation regimens where that's employed. So, like I said, the zinc is assimilated rather quickly. This is like this slide you see on the the right-hand side here. This bright green stain shows how concentrated yeast is at the start of fermentation, and then it is redistributed via reproduction. So as those yeast cells bud out, you'll see the zinc levels, die off dramatically. And in an active fermentation, I mean, you see your zinc content is almost zero after an hour. So think about those high sucrose washes that you're trying to get your yeast to charge through, and this where the idea or the concept of a fed nutrient regimen or staggered nutrient regimen is required. For further information on that, I've got some not only some TDS documents, but some best practices about how to perform a non-sucrose, or a non-malt ferment. That I'm happy to share with everybody outside of this presentation. So O2, I see a few questions coming in. Awesome, thanks. We'll get to those here at the end of the presentation. So O2. So O2 is primarily utilized as a growth factor and not necessarily as a respiratory factor. What we're really looking for here is the production of ergosterol and oleic acid from oxygen. And this is important for the not only ethanol tolerance and glycogen mobilization, but ultimately it comes down to membrane integrity. So we want to limber up that cell wall, not only to facilitate budding, but also the ingress and egress of metabolites that we're looking to move in and out of the cell wall. So here's some other vitamin sources, typically supplied by a all malt wort that you have to be cognizant of if you're doing something other than that. So folic acid, thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, etc. Biotin can or cannot be based on your wort composition, but it can certainly be supplemented with full spectrum yeast food. So, and here are some of the typical levels of these vitamins that can be found in a standard wort. They are important, so that's why it needs to be considered if you're using something that's a primary sugar. So the yeast cell has a tendency to throw up some barriers to us getting nutrients in, and some metabolites out of the cell wall. Primarily, the exterior structure of the cell wall, in addition to a cell plasma membrane and periplasm, will throw up barriers. So some physicochemical barriers that can occur as well. Chelation, which is really a kind of a binding of elements so that they can't get in and out. And that can be as a result of incorrect nutrients or insufficient nutrients in the wort stream. If there's stresses on the cell that will prevent add or absorption of these elements, in addition just to the straight molecular size. So if you don't have that ergosterol and that oleic acid providing, a limber pathway for this to get through the yeast, then ain't nothing going to happen. So, and here's a shot of kind of a cross section of the cellular plasma membrane. Now, this is a human cell membrane, and so ergosterol is found in lieu of cholesterol. Little yellow dots there on the interior structure, but you can see that it's a complex system. And if this is too rigid or bound, then and that membrane is not flexible, then you're not going to achieve a sufficient fermentation. So now, assuming that that we're limber, here is a description of some of the transport mechanisms that we'll be talking about. So how does the wort nutrients move in and out of the yeast cell? So three primary diffusion channels are passive, so they do not require any sort of energy consumption. Free diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and then a gated diffusion channel, which is a charged protein that will open and close. Think of a gatekeeper in a protein-based diffusion channel. Permease or enzymatic based or facilitated diffusion, where the enzyme is carrying something through or moving something out. And then the fun one, I think, which is active transport. We'll talk about that here in a minute. But take a gander at the wort nutrients that move through a passive diffusion. So CO and O2, ethanol, glucose, fructose, sucrose, right? So those starting sugars, or those primary sugars, they're moving through the cell with no energy consumption. So that's why the cell is going to take that stuff up first. And if you have an elevated level of any of those sugars, well, that can bind up kind of the process and create that suppressive character. So look at what does require energy through active transport. And this is where maltose, maltotriose, nitrogen, and other minerals, sorry, are metabolized through the cell wall. So, and this active transport is really through the employ of something called ATP, and it's enzymatic cofactor ATPase. And think about this as what it really is. It's a charged hydrogen pump. So it's taken a positive hydrogen element and moving it through the cell wall to replace it with a negative, right? So, and that's how it will move these. That's the transport mechanism to move this nutrient through the membrane. Free diffusions, it's passive penetration, so it moves relatively slow. The facilitated diffusion channels, both permease and the proteins, are relatively quick because they're driven by a cofactor. And then the active transport, that energy requiring process, it can be relatively slow, but any of you that have used any of the recent Kvike strains, Voss, knows that that's contingent upon the specific strain that you're using. So a little bit more about this ATPase action. It's required for the regulation for nutrient uptake. So think the growth of your biomass and the fermentation of your wort. It regulates cell pH. And it's also critical in the production of the overall or total acidity of your finished product. 30% of acids produced or found in your finished beer come from this active transport mechanism of ATPase. The other 70% will come from organic acids and carbonic acid via CO2 production. So some of the main component transport mechanisms that employed by yeast, water through a diffused channel, amino acids and other metal ions through diffusion channels, ethanol through 3 diffusion, sugars as noted through both types. Depending on whether it's a malt-based sugar or or one of the starting or primary sugars. And so, talking about starting sugars, the concept of glucose suppression. You can see here that the yeast is going to go for the easiest food first before it requires any energy. So something to consider when you're creating your washes and formulating your nutrient additions. you see, it took maltose, a full 24 hours before it started being consumed, and only after the glucose was consumed first. So, and how some problems can come about from the mismanagement of the nutrients available in wort. The design of the sugars available on the spectrum, can lead to a high glucose repression, which can result in a problem ferment. The availability of some of the metal ions, low zinc, excess calcium, insufficient magnesium, toxic metals. All of these can cause fermentation problems. Think about other inhibitory components, herbicides, pesticides that come in on a raw ingredient, cleaning agents. Did you get all that pear sand out of that tank? Before you pitch your yeast in there, all this stuff can contribute to issues. Insufficient O2. If you don't have correct levels of ergosterol and oleic acid, well, you're going to get a bound cell wall that will not reproduce correctly. Vitamin deficiencies can lead to sulfuric notes, and again, typically these can be off-putting. I mean, not unless you're doing a specific lager style, would you rarely want a sulfur component to your beer. You have a low amount of fan in your wort, then you're going to get a problem, a ferment. And then the physical chemical agents, if some of these elements aren't available, then it causes undue stress on your yeast. And rarely does that turn out well, either for your initial ferment, but certainly if you plan on using that yeast further down the road. So some conclusions about all this is that what we're really looking to do here, really what we're looking to do here is strive to achieve a balance between yeast growth and fermentation. Understand that that wort is food to these critters. And as I once existed on shift pints and leftover pizza that was provided to me by my boss, what we deliver through the nutrient is what the yeast is using to perform its job. So nutritive factors need careful consideration when you're designing your wort and planning your brews. All right. So hopefully we've been able to cover these 5 points. You've got at least an inkling of how complex this topic can be, but we've covered the basics. As always, if you're looking for products to help you with your brewing, please reach out. We've got a couple of nutrient-specific products that can help in that regard. For further education on this topic, I'm going to recommend a specialized lecture available through the Siebel Institute. This is an online presentation delivered by Dr. Graham Walker. It's a comprehensive lecture that's part of the advanced theory program offered by the World Brewing Academy collaborative partnership between Siebel Institute and Domans. And if you reach out to me via email, I have a discount code that I can share with you. I'll put my email contact in here as well, but here's some general contact info for Lallemand AB Vickers. I don't have the Scott Labs info up here, but it's beer.scott. Or scottlabs.com. As always, you can stay up to date. Sign up on the social and alternative medias. We have a brews letter that we're starting to put out on a regular basis, and that's got some fun facts and info there as well. And I appreciate you sitting through this past hour-ish with me, and we will move to some questions here. So thank you to my moderator for putting all of this together. I'll just leave this contact screen up. Out of the gate, I'm going to start Mr. Campbell here in chat asking if peracetic acid is a concern. No, but just make sure that if you've got a lot of folks I know, and I have been guilty of this myself, going a little strong on the peracetic. It just gives you the confidence and the confidence of clean, getting that out of your tank. Just make sure that you don't have a pool of something. Exactly. You don't have a pool of sitting at the bottom of your cone, and you've decided to pitch a yeast or a slurry in at that moment. All right. Let's see here. Do dry yeast, this is from Andy, do dry yeast contain additional nutrients already? Is there any need to add yeast nutrients to the wort? So dried yeast has an additional or elevated level of glycerol, which is something that we do in the manufacturing process. So think about how much stress that a yeast cell is going to go through to get to a dehydrated state, and then the stresses that we're going to put it through in coming back out of that. So you may have heard that you don't need to aerate your yeast when using a dry pitch, and indeed that is true. That dried yeast is supercharged and ready to go straight into your wort stream. If you're running a staff, I mean, don't change your. It's not necessary to change your SOP. Aerating that batch is not going to be detrimental to the yeast itself. But yes, we do have to jack the yeast up in order to get it through the stresses of dehydration and its return to a rehydrated state. For Alistair, I'm playing with a high gravity dextrose based fermentation and seeing high levels of sulfury notes. Any ideas? Yes. You need to bump up not only zinc but also copper levels. So a spectrum nutrient can be employed in in this regard. And then we could also talk about the addition of say like a copper sulfate to your wort. You have my email here. Shoot me an email if you have further questions. The old favorite: rehydrate yeast prior to pitching, or just sprinkle it straight onto the wort. Yes and no. By and large, not necessarily to rehydrate. So this really, by and large, you're going to be just fine. It's going to make great beer. It'll be efficient. But what you can consider and should is, if you're looking for a specific flavor attribute out of your yeast, some strains perform better flavor-wise rehydration versus dehydrated, and vice versa. And then also, and I think it's probably something a little more important to consider, and I'll be doing a presentation on this topic at HomebrewCon at the end of June, is when you're planning on using, or you're planning on repitching, so further downstream. So you want to try to get, 6, 10, 20 generations out of your initial pitch, which is definitely possible, depending on the yeast strain that you're using and your production process. But nutrient addition, in addition to rehydration, definitely plays a role in achieving that goal. So I can imagine that this being another We Brew With You online topic for the future. Any Mark, any particular considerations when using Kveik yeast? Yeah. Get out of the way. I've only been using the Voss, and all those fermentations rip at a 95 to 100 degree Fahrenheit ferments. I haven't monkeyed with a cold and slow, but it's done fast. So I think a lot of information is still new on this. Specifically when it comes to using these for alternative fermentations. I did one batch of hard cider, and I know that I got a lot more sulfur off of it than the typical Saison strain that I use, Belle Saison, or the French Saison, which is a diastaticus strain. So, I guess more to come on this topic as more breweries start to employ Kveik strains in other types of ferments. But right now, the Voss is just a flat out rock star, and it's been dominating every fermentation that we've not only that we executed ourselves, but involved in trials. So, hi Brian, what style of beer would benefit most from elevated zinc additions? So I would think lagers. You tend to have a slower fermentation in terms of its overall curve, and then anything outside of a standard wort. So high gravity, high adjunct. You doing a cider, you doing a seltzer, You doing yeah, you doing something imperial, something high gravity. What other stresses are you delivering? So say maybe you're trying to do a sour beer, right? So that's going to stress your yeast out. Give it some zinc. Use some cervomyces. I mean, unless it's just your standard, like your standard wort composition, I think most ferments would benefit and styles would benefit from a zinc addition. Hopefully that answers your question. The all grain wort, this is from Esteban. Hola, senor. The all grain wort have enough zinc for the fermentation or add some extra zinc salts? So again, look at it, what it is that you're trying to do. If it's a base wort, a standard wort, all grain, you'll probably be fine. You start pushing the boundaries, which most craft beer does, either through gravity, 6.5% and up, and or any of the alternative ferments that you're trying to do. You definitely need use a zinc addition, please. You and your yeast will be happier for it. And finally, from Tom here, if glycogen is released into beer during fermentation, assuming from yeast lysis, poor yeast health, storage, etc., can this be reabsorbed, broken down, taken up by healthy yeast during fermentation? And can delayed harvesting help improve reuptake in fermentation if it occurs? So yes to the first point, or to your first part of that question, to a point. I think that there are limits, and those limits need to be defined based on the fermentation that you're trying to conduct. The second point, honestly, I don't know. Delayed harvesting to help that reuptake. I mean, think about harvesting. Some strains you want to harvest at like a high kreuzen off of a top crop. I mean, you think that you get an optimum yeast health and pitch through that method. Some strains require, have like a healthy flock mechanism, pre-chilling. Some, excuse me. Some strains flock better post-chilling, and then flock out differently. So I would. That's a great question, Tom. I think if you would please send me an email at bperkey@lalaman.com, and I'll get Mr. Abbott, our global technical advisor, and the guys in the lab up in Montreal, and get their take on that. That's a great point. What am I drinking? Well, at the moment, it's coffee, because it's still 10 a.m. Here in the Pacific Northwest. But my weapon of choice, beer-wise, is from my local little brew pub called CELLULAR, which is a half block down, and they actually have a golden ale that's produced with our Voss strain, this Kvike strain, and it's delicious beer. Nice low alcohol, great for the summer weather that we're having here in the Northwest. Mr. Watson, yes, sir. I'm happy to offer up these slides for this presentation. Please shoot me an email at bperkey@lalaman, and I'm happy to share. Any further questions? I do hope that you reach. Oh, we got another question coming in. Okay, I wasn't going to talk about it, but I love this topic. And this is from Francisco Moro. And his question is, some people suggest to substitute oxygenation with putting olive oil into the wort. Yeast can really uptake this lipid and benefit from them. So yes and no. Remember that the ergosterol and oleic acid are two of the things that that oxygen help provide the yeast, while olive oil is pretty much straight oleic acid. You can get online and look up the research. Shoot me an email and I can email it to you as well. But it was a study that New Belgium did, ages ago, where they did some simultaneous fermentations on their fat tire with the use of olive oil. And really it came down to, there's really no difference. I think there was a slight lag on fermentation by a half a day or so. So they opted not to use it. But the great thing is that say you get stuck, like it's a great, like, oh crap, fix it. Your tank runs out, your regulator blew, there's something wrong with your stone, somebody forgot to turn the air on. A little bit of olive oil will help provide that, so you can get the fermentation done and out of the way. On a different note, in the ciders that I make, I only use olive oil for my aeration when I'm using a liquid strain, which anymore it never happens. So I'm on the dried train at this point. Last question here from Luke. Seltzers, commonly cane sugar bases, have little to no nutrients for the fermentation. What do you recommend as a nutrient strategy? Luke, send me an email, please. bperkey@lalaman.com. I have a whole best practices and some TDS information that I can send to you to how to go about pulling off a decent seltzer ferment. I can imagine this being its own separate topic for an additional We Brew With You online lecture. So keep your eyes peeled for that. With all of that in mind, I appreciate your time of putting up with me this morning. We're a little over our hour, but that's all good. I hope you all stay safe and healthy out there. Have a great Wednesday or wherever, whatever time zone you happen to be, and we will see you another time. You all take care. Cheers.